Hello again. It's been a little while and we were pretty heresy heavy, so I wanted to pivot back to a favourite topic of interest, but with a twist of perspective. That being the technological expansion and collapse of human knowledge in the 40k setting. Also, this video is definitely a lot of me waffling about just stuff. So for those with wafer-thin patience for such things, basically the premise is it's difficult to reacquire what was lost from the dark age of technology because things are complicated. There you go. Please do hit like and subscribe. For everybody else, we'll continue on. In my mind, it always feels as if I spoke about these subjects all too recently, and then whenever I actually go back and look at what the last relevant video was, it's always like several years ago, something about how time works in our mind versus reality, constantly subjective. All I know is since my daughter came along, my life has been a blur. Now, this is a topic that I've covered the bulk of already with the STC videos, which I have dutifully linked below. Those videos speak for themselves in providing the context and foundation for understanding STC, what we know, and the technological state of the Imperium. Today, though, I want to look at how their existence, intact or not, fundamentally influenced certain decisions, and how even though we may not have locked down details to attribute things to, we can reasonably piece together logical assumptions based on what we do know, or at least what it points toward. Before that, please do excuse a very brief summary of default human expansion in the 40k galaxy for the sake of the ever-present newcomers. In the timeline of 40k in the Imperium, human civilization's meteoric rise to its technological zenith began as you might expect, the colonization of its own solar system, then later expanding to worlds beyond the edge of our own system. During this early time, humanity was limited to using sub-light travel and vast colony ships. It's believed not entirely dissimilarly to the conceptual craft known as O'Neill cylinders. These are a large theoretical colony ship which has been illustrated in movies like Interstellar. Due to the great distances involved, travelling at even quite significant partial light speed will require centuries and generations. In fact, partial light speed can have a pretty minimal impact on the length of time to reach a destination until you really get up to the higher end of that scale. Once you're up to about 80% of light speed, while travelling to our nearest star 4.25 light years away, that's going to take you just over 3 years from the perspective of those aboard the ship, which is pretty quick. That same journey at, let's just say, 3% of light speed would take a sobering 142 years, and if it were 1%, you're looking at over 400 years. But it is a big scale, and reaching the higher end is not necessarily particularly easy to do. Anyway, the point is simply that it takes a long time because in the period of early human expansion, warp travel had not yet developed. And that created the next problem for them, which is due to that travel time, they could not easily reinforce those now isolated colony worlds. This is the kind of problem we actually face now in terms of sending people to Mars. Yes, you might be able to make a ship and transport the things that people need to get there. You might successfully land it on the surface. They might be able to establish a base. But suddenly what happens if you have a problem? It's going to be quite a significant amount of time before you can get something from here to there to reinforce and help them. And it may well be that if that problem was significant, everybody might die before you could actually help them. That's a problem in the Imperium now, and it was a problem when they were first expanding human colonization. And isolation was a destabilizing threat for a variety of reasons, including of course Xenos at this time, because things like the Orcs were very much still out there, but a more significant problem was the security of their most valuable possession, human knowledge. New settlements could fail if key experts died or some disaster depopulated the colony. There was an uprising, a power struggle. All of these kind of things make sense. One remedy for this was seen in the STC, the Standard Template Construct System. Essentially, this was designed as a vault for the sum total of all humanity's knowledge, which could be accessed by colonists. thereby enabling them the vital technology even absent of somebody who understood it being physically present. They could just ask it to do what they needed, and problem solved. Beyond this, it is said to have allowed them to also shape their environment and use whatever materials present to make a world habitable, terraforming effectively. So that's what the STC were designed to do. But returning to my concept of the STC lie, well, where things become confusing for us is not having all contextual information about these STC, which again I've discussed before in terms of functionality and efficiency. How many STC were there? Did they change over time? And so on. In M41, the Mechanicus search endlessly for STC or even fragments of them. As one of their most critical objectives, they search for these so-called hard copy STC templates, more than an actual STC itself. The templates are like a blueprint to produce whatever is encoded onto that, and I've often speculated it's strange that there are these specific hard copies. I liken them to something like a silicon wafer or a crystal data form that's able to theoretically survive for thousands of years, because that's the only realistic means by which something is going to survive for that long. Whereas an actual STC was more akin to a vastly advanced true AI with a 3D print fabricator connected to it, because it allowed you to design, produce just about whatever you needed. If the climate became unstable or unsuitable, it could design and produce a terraforming construct or some other protective means by which to mitigate the issue. If you're under threat from aliens, it's going to design armor or weapons for you or automated systems to do that. Earth too difficult for farming, they're going to make special tractors. A plague destroying your colony, it will analyze and cure this. This is what STC were, as far as we know. But not much of that survived to M41. It often seems like STC just disappeared completely in the dark age of technology. But there remained examples of colonies and ships that existed as surviving remnants of the STC era. The Imperium remains near to entirely unaware of them. There are multiple stories whereby characters or missions deal with STC-derived technology. There are archives, there are literal surviving STC. But even when it's right in front of them, often those of the Imperium fail to fully realize what that is, beyond sometimes acknowledging the abominable intelligence. And it's this which gets part way to the heart of what I'm talking about today, that this technology is not just powerful and needed by the Imperium. It's that it is so far advanced beyond how and what the Mechanicus currently search for that it underscores how the Imperium doesn't even seem to really understand what an actual functional STC is, or the variety of redundancies in which it could appear. I'm sure that somebody like Malkador or the Emperor would definitely understand this, but obviously they are not around, and the vast majority do not understand. Most often, as I said, with the Imperium and Mechanicus, they may recognize something is an AI, but then they're just going to immediately want to destroy it, which is of course comical because they both fear and loathe that which they really need the most. Now, two other things I need to state here is that, for one, when we say AI, we mean actual AI, not the fake AI that we hear spoken about nearly every day and that I restrain myself from going on a whole tangent about. But yes, it pains me that I need to make that clarification. But we're not speaking about an algorithmic machine construct that makes constant, incomprehensible errors wherever it's applied. We're talking about actual, true, self-aware AI. Artificial intelligence that has incomprehensible power also. We've seen this literally in 40k, where they're able to lock down power suits remotely, carve through Imperial ships like butter. So AI, when they're encountered in the Imperium, they don't just rival humans or the Mechanicus, they are far beyond this. They are truly terrifying in the scale of power they hold, because unlike the Mechanicus, they remain seemingly able to understand, connect with, and utilize the maximum power that humanity achieved in its technological zenith. And it's often clear that what surrounds an AI, whether it's on a ship or on a planet, most of what it engages with, the Imperium seem completely unaware that even any of these things are even technology, let alone what it is that they're supposed to do. There was this Mechanicus ship, for example, that awakened its AI and proceeded to deploy weaponry that the crew didn't even realize it was armed with. It shifted an Eldari ship fractionally in time so that it occupied the same physical space with itself and immediately suffered a catastrophic scale of damage. So when we see AI in the Imperium in 40k, they are able to access this technological zenith level of power. The second point is to remind about the unavoidable speculative element here. Whenever we're talking about anything pre-M30, the information available diminishes to just scraps that merely point towards events or the history of what occurred. Sometimes there may be accounts, very often these are not particularly trustworthy. So we're left to just make logical assumptions. But there are instances where we've seen AI integrated with so-called STC constructors. For example, in Tanith, First and Oni, also Priests of Mars, in the latter specifically is that Mechanicus ship, the Speranza. Now, does this mean that all STC had integrated constructors? We don't know. Were there STC that just provided information, some sort of terminal or an AI integrated as we've seen in ships and cities as some kind of overseer? Maybe people had to construct the things themselves and it just provided guidelines? We don't know. Were STC initially implemented and developed by humans without AI involved, created at perhaps a more basic level before then later being upgraded? We do know that a little bit. I'll talk about it later, but you get the idea. But it is for this reason as to why STC remains so interesting to discuss, because that is fundamentally one of the aspects that I enjoy about 40k the most, that is, the speculative, the logical calculations. I've spent many hours over the years doing just that regarding STC, and whenever an interesting idea came along, I'd make a note of it to then pick apart later. I think one of the longest discussions of which was with my friend who some of you may know or recall, Flamefang, somebody who's heavily versed in history and lore, 40k, Star Wars. He has a big perspective, and so we spent many hours having an enjoyable debate regarding the logical plausibility of why STC existed at all in terms of their functionality in a human galactic federation, if we take at face value how they worked as described. The major consideration was that, as we understood it, humanity had this vast interstellar trade network for their civilization at that time. So why was anybody ever trading if they had these magical STC that could just fabricate anything you needed or solve critical survival issues with existing local resources so easily? I think once you run through the logically speculative options, you run out of scenarios and it becomes more obvious. Because even if STC were as powerful as they seem to be, it comes down to more efficiency and within that scope, material scarcity. If a planet held a low level of a critical resource, or your colony just burned through this during the first centuries of constructing their new civilization, yes, probably an STC theoretically could convert other material to your needs. But in terms of practicality, we speculated that it could be just more efficient to bring raw materials into a system and a world in a more conventional manner than to transform by whatever means from some other material. Typically, any such process might be resource intensive and therefore inefficient. Now, perhaps an STC solved that basic problem, but it's hard to see how. Again though, maybe that's why they're so magic from the view of the ignorant. But of course, maybe more simply, they just chose to trade over localized conversion for very human reasons. And just an important note, I think earlier I said about how in the beginning they could only travel at sub-light speeds. Obviously, once they had reached the point of this interstellar civilization which was trading and moving around, the navigators had begun to emerge and they were traveling through the warp, which is why they're able to do that at all. So again, yes, your STC might be able to convert materials from your own planet, but if a guy turns up on a ship and goes, hey, I've got like 1 billion tons of this ore, do you just want it? I can dump it right now, it's easy. That's going to be a hell of a lot easier. Exceptions, yeah, maybe your system becomes isolated or routes to your planet unstable and dangerous, then despite any inefficiency, the STC is going to win. But that's all just one convoluted concept. The point really is that STC are, again, unclear in terms of how their usage was implemented, but at a very base level, they're just this problem-solving AI, really. All of this brought me to the thought for this video. which is essentially, the more you think about STC, the more you come to realize how we generally think about them wrong, at least in terms of the continuing reverberations they create via their contemporary and historical impact. And I'll explain what I mean, because as we know, and to nobody's surprise, STC remain key for the Imperium, which is why it's worth talking about. Humanity is beset on all sides by the Xenos and the Heretic. But that doesn't mean they wouldn't be happy for the Mechanicus to stumble onto an ultra-advanced new starship template. Or, for example, that one time they nearly secured a panacea for all diseases and plagues, which for some reason they didn't achieve and ended up just having a bit of a battle. That was a wildly missed opportunity. How about a cheap, easily produced, less complex power armor that could be mass-produced for the Imperial Guard, something that's maybe Solar Auxiliary Plus? And no, don't look in that underhive of that planet, what was it called, Necromunda? Nothing to see there, don't worry about how well equipped that random criminal gang is. They probably just got some strange merchant equipping them off-world. Definitely don't need to look there, no STC or templates you're looking for. But anyway, the crux of it is that I don't think STC are really as magical as they sometimes may be portrayed, or at least in the sense of the difference they would make in M41. Because in other respects they absolutely are, and it certainly does not mean that the discovery of an intact STC or constructor wouldn't bring forward the Imperium. But a new golden age? That's a different matter. Because I've said that in the past, and I'm not entirely sure whether or not that would happen now. I think probably in the scale of technology the Imperium has and what it's facing, it would bring it forward in a very significant way. But could it reach Dark Age of technology levels? Very unlikely, and for specific reasons. Because along with their general functionality, even were that to happen, those within the Imperium would still be hamstrung by certain caveats, certain Mechanicus caveats. And it's this, along with other ideas of the Emperor, that I want to discuss today. Now, similarly to the STC, I've made many videos also about the Mechanicus and the Mechanicum, and yes, 0101, 111, 0101, 11101 to the COG enjoyers out there. But let me pour sour milk on all that by saying the Mechanicus are in actuality far from bringing their A game. But to be fair, in some respects, it's not entirely their fault, because they have more than fair reasoning for playing it more than reasonably safe. On the other hand, they are absolutely hamstringing the Imperium and slowly dooming humanity through 10 millennia of backward thinking, which is at least partly responsible for causing its slowly decaying demise. The few who have attempted to push forward often end up being persecuted by the cult, and little ever is truly achieved. But why? Well, it is of course a mixture of fear and belief, not to mention the events of the heresy. Now, I won't reiterate the whole story of the Mechanicum and the cult and the Mechanicus. We all know the basic core of what it's about, that during the Age of Strife, Mars imploded, as did so many worlds. It went from a terraformed technology center back into a desert rock that was irradiated and racked by horrifying storms. Of those who survived, war descended, until eventually those who won out were they who had committed themselves to a cult, the cult of the machine, the cult Mechanicus. They would become the Mechanicum, and those who put all their faith both literally and spiritually into technology. They would send ships out into the stars to rediscover worlds far before the Emperor returned to Mars, and so they founded the first Forge worlds. Later, when the Emperor came during the unification, Mars had such strategic and military wealth that the Emperor knew he could not risk them choosing any other option than cooperation with his plans. And so, the Mechanicus were allowed to become one of the rare institutions to retain their own autonomy, which they retain even 10,000 years later in M41. Other than this, the other schism was of course the heresy, where the Mechanicum of Mars at that time broke apart much like the Astartes, leaving loyalist Forge worlds, Magos and Tech Priests throughout the galaxy and many collected upon terror to petition for efforts to be made to retake Mars and secure whatever could be of its vital technology and archives. It was, as with everything during this time, highly destructive and led to the Mechanicum dividing into the Adeptus Mechanicus, while those aligned to Horus would be known as the Dark Mechanicum. When it comes to technology in the Imperium, one of the most important aspects is the resistance to innovation, but also catastrophic loss. It's helpful, I think, to understand such things through other historical comparisons. For example, the Bronze Age collapse. That was an event which demonstrated how quickly advancements can be lost. This occurred somewhere around 1200 BCE. The Eastern Mediterranean was a network of kingdoms linked by trade, diplomacy, and shared technical knowledge, not unlike humanity in the Golden Age. It was, at that time, a pretty standard setup for any developing civilization or region as such: resources, demand, specialists, fabrication. In the Imperium, you have demand through its tithes and various departments requiring arms and hardware. You've got the specialists of the Mechanicus and the fabrication upon Forge Worlds. But then, in the ancient time, things collapsed. In the space of a decade, palaces burned, trade routes vanished, and entire states disappeared from historical record. The causes were numerous, but more important was the effect. Once the network's interdependence collapsed, without stable exchange, there was no reliable access to raw materials. Without long-distance caravans and fleets, literacy and knowledge also slowed significantly, as this was necessary only for diplomatic and commercial exchange. So in a collapsing environment, the need for such things diminished sharply. And that's not supposition, it's documented how libraries burned, certain written systems just vanished entirely in that period. Skills like complex metalwork, construction, precision carpentry, advanced shipbuilding, all of which suffered as technologies that relied on coordination and continuous practice, they're the first to degrade after such a systemic shock. But cultures weren't entirely destroyed, they rarely are. Usually they will endure and just reform to become something else, and the decline can be very uneven. Some may survive better than others, retain their knowledge, just like human civilization after and during the Age of Strife. It's a very good comparison. The archaeological record around the time of the Bronze Age collapse demonstrates just this. But what's critical to note in terms of this comparison is that obviously, unlike the Mechanicus in the 10,000 years post-heresy, the ancient cultures were not a world that accepted that new, darkened and reduced state. People adapted, survived, travelled, reinvented. So what disappeared were the technologies that depended on scale and cooperation, those shared systems of knowledge. In that time, they learned how to create new and more powerful systems and technology based on what they had once again. And I think it's this notable comparison because unlike humans who historically, when you see civilization collapse, rebuild, use what they have to learn from and move forward, that is notably not what the Mechanicus and the Imperium do. Once a network that sustains so many levels of technology, learning and production is sharply or significantly disrupted, the fall can be steep, and while the event can be brief, recovery and rebuilding can take centuries, if not far longer. So in terms of what I call the Stupid Mechanicus, this is mainly due to the paradox that their existence creates, because on the one hand, their attitude and approach makes all the sense in the world. On the other, it's absolutely counterproductive and actively prevents progress. They are inheritors of the oldest surviving technological traditions and custodians of the great manufactoria, the stewards of knowledge reaching all the way back to the Dark Age of technology, that 99% of humans in the Imperium have little if any concept that this time ever occurred. Yet they themselves are one of the primary obstacles to technological advancement, and this is mainly due to the principles that structure the cult Mechanicus, and thereby prevent not just innovation, but any kind of free inquiry needed for sustained technological growth and stability, the root cause of that being doctrine. But all of this is very problematic for several reasons. The cult Mechanicus treats knowledge not as retained information that can be drawn from. Rather, they see any and all knowledge as divine revelation, rather than a field of investigation. They believe that the Omnissiah has already provided all knowledge that will ever be needed. Their role is to simply recover and discover this, to then use it. Innovation and creation is just entirely antithetical to their entire religion. They even have a word for those who break from their rules and dare to abuse technology or redevelop it to their own design. Heretics, with a K. They see ancient design as sacred, so any deviation from specifically how they're laid out from STC templates will be treated with the same severity as an inquisitor or a member of the ecclesiarchy might imperial religious heresy. Now, at the same time, it would be wrong to completely ignore the fact that this has been a means by which the Mechanicus have existed for 10,000 years and longer, because only through their focus upon doctrinal obedience and ritual repetition are the Magi trained to replicate these sanctioned processes, to follow established schematics and observe the strict hierarchies of instruction, whilst at the same time limiting or even allowing any thought of innovation. But the goal of this is preservation rather than understanding. This was the entire core founding of the cult Mechanicus, survival through technical repetition. Because when Mars collapsed in the Dark Age of technology, the few who survived that apocalypse only did so by maintaining technology that was far more complex than they were able to understand, and passing on that information became absolutely critical to their long-term survival. It was very much a necessity rather than a decision. They had neither the will nor capacity to innovate beyond this, just as now in M41, survival is one of the primary focuses. And many technology remains functional only because generations of adepts memorize the correct rites, sequences, and calibrations. And honestly, that is to be celebrated. To think about what an achievement that is. 10,000 years for the Mechanicus to have kept the technology of the Imperium turning and being produced and maintained over this extreme span of time. It's an incredible achievement. Unfortunately, such rigidity also has less positive consequences. And there is a conversation to be had, and maybe you want to tell me in the comments of this video, the debate between the Mechanicus observing that which they see as necessary, but also causing stagnation. The Mechanicus suppresses or destroys discovered work that they consider heretic, which can broadly apply not only to dangerous or forbidden research, but really any attempt to improve, modify, or reinterpret established designs. I think just a small aside there is some wiggle room. They obviously have different weapons which may perform slightly better. They might find that a certain Forge world may produce a plasma weapon that works a bit better, and they sort of lean towards that. But there's definitely a tolerance, and there isn't very much like room to move, as it were. Overall, the point is that being so unwilling to innovate is not necessarily particularly helpful when you're fighting against the likes of the Tau, the Tyrannid, or indeed any race which adapt at speed. But another major source of technological loss and stupidity by the Mechanicus is their extreme centralization of production. This is where some advanced technologies are fabricated only on a handful of Forge worlds. Titan Legion's specific plasma reactor types, rare armor patterns, and certain class of weapons that exist solely because individual forges maintain the capability to produce them. And that could be because they have sort of the honor of producing that thing, or it may be that the fabrication tools needed to produce it are just not well understood by the Mechanicus, and so it ends up being produced on this singular world. I think you can see where this is going, because there is a major problem with that. If or when those worlds are destroyed by Xenos war, insurrection, and environmental failure, being overthrown by insurgent forces, or just some unknown force majeure, well then the knowledge disappears, and you would hope that the Mechanicus would have retained all relevant knowledge in their Temple of All Knowledge on Mars, or in other subsidiary data repositories. The answer is, not necessarily. The heresy alone accounted for the loss of countless manufacturia, databanks, entire technological lineages. In the millennia since, similar losses have still occurred due to, again, alien incursion, conflicts within the Mechanicus itself. Absolutely astonishing. I'm laughing. Absolutely astonishingly, for a culture which considers specifically revealed technology divine and to be valued above all, there is little data or network redundancy apparent, and it is absolutely insane that losing a single Forge World could mean the extinction of a specific type of technology, which is why I couldn't think of anything better than to describe this as the Stupid Mechanicus. But we're not done, because there's the compounding factor we mentioned already of technology being maintained through rights, because the underlying science is only partly understood. Now, as I said, the Mechanicus is paradoxical, because on the one hand, if something can't be understood, well, it's better that it is maintained. It's difficult to also document in terms of maintenance if you don't understand it. So you would think, though, wouldn't you, that somebody might still try to make some kind of understanding in terms of how to look after a thing. Again, not necessarily. In the Imperium, a functioning piece of relic technology might rely on a single specialist cohort, a lone Magos, or some random databank. So, again, when they're lost, whatever it was that they were tasked to maintain could just degrade beyond repair, if anybody's even aware that it's there in the first place. I don't think that's universally the case, and there's some speculation here, but it certainly does happen. Over centuries, you're going to have unmonitored gaps accumulating the maintenance, producing gradual technological decay. Certain things are going to slip through the administration. And I think this feels to be very much like those consequences of trying to maintain a galactic civilization, that it is just beyond comprehension in terms of complexity. It's the same as the Adeptus Terra and the Administratum making small admin errors, but then actually doom a planet to starvation or annihilation by alien horrors. Now, my final thought on this section is about the fundamental failure of the Mechanicus. Yes, they are the stewards of technology. Yes, they provide for the Imperium a function that really no other institution could. This is why the Imperium is kind of stuck with them. And even so, you can't take away from them the service they provide. On the other hand, for a group dedicated to the preservation of knowledge, they provide a pretty unacceptably variable level of performance. I think you can attribute this to their unwillingness to even tolerate basic levels of human innovation, something which, it's important to note, was more tolerated during the Crusade era of the Emperor, because you saw Space Marines equipped, refined and improved. They redesigned a lot of the stuff they were working with, often in no small amount of variation either, significant redesigns of Terminator and power armor, weapons and so on, all of which kind of just ceased post-heresy. That's why you just get these marks of Space Marine armor that really are very, very minimal in terms of how different they are. And as per the Bronze Age collapse already anywhere you look through human history, when societies experiment and refine their tools, they don't just create new technology, they create more versions of old ones. We're talking again about redundancy. If you don't know what that term is, redundancy just means storing that same information in different locations or format so that no singular point of failure can destroy it. Like if you have some important files, back them up on multiple different methods so that if one fails, you've still got access to it. And we do this now with our knowledge. We even have genetic vaults that could be called upon in a true global catastrophe. And as I noted, the Mechanicus do this to a degree, but often seemingly not well enough, which really isn't acceptable. A solution to this would be more sharing of knowledge, because the more people who explore technology and can understand, then this naturally means more records, more practiced techniques, more contextual knowledge surrounding the original idea. Every act of innovation is going to generate redundancy. Every successful experiment creates another path back to the core concept if one other version is lost. And I think these are all practices that somebody like Belisarius Cawl would be absolutely keen for if he was, say, made Fabricated General, while most other Magos would be decrying it as heretic behaviour. And I think that really says everything you need it to about the Mechanicus. For the Imperium, though, they are not concerned with these same religious issues and constraints. What they see is stagnation, which causes these singular critical points of failure, especially in a galaxy riven by war, resource scarcity, political firestorms, and just continual loss through worlds becoming isolated. The greatest problem for the Mechanicus is that resistance to understanding, but also a fear of who controls that understanding. They really do not want entire hive cities learning to build titans because that could create obvious problems. Yet, consider this. What's worse, a rebelling world or the loss of a whole design that originated from the Dark Age of technology? Because sure, whilst a new design might differ from the original and offend the Omnissiah, in creating it, those engineers must rediscover so many fundamental principles, equations, tolerances, materials required to do, and so on. And again, just to reiterate, that's another reason why Belisarius Cawl is such an interesting figure, because one of his core principles is not just about what can we do with what we have, but understanding what that technology is and how it functions, so that you can then extrapolate that data and concept and apply it in different ways. He even wants to look at stuff like Necron technology so that he can understand it and use it for the betterment and empowerment of the Imperium. Imagine if all the Mechanicus had that same vision and approach, because it is the only path toward true empowerment for humanity in terms of technology. Because very obviously over time, the cumulative effect would be a culture where many people know how something works, not just how to repeat a prescribed dogmatic method. With a wider base of comprehension, this makes the knowledge harder to destroy, which is going to make your society and culture more enduring as well. Which I'm sad to say is not the case for the Imperium. It's not the case for our world right now. A great many people can't even make fire these days, which is just incomprehensible. And it's why in previous videos I've said if we ever suffered a true global catastrophe, I think humanity would not be set back a few years or generations. I think we'd be looking at a Stone Age level of collapse in terms of people's understanding. And I don't think that's too extreme of a statement to make. And it's why I need to go back and make this other apocalypse video. Anyway, the Mechanicus is problematic because it's not just about how it views technology in terms of it being sacred and divine and not able to be altered in any way. It's also about how it restricts learning and is fearful of any innovation. But the big question is, of course, within the context of M41 and the Imperium, which of these approaches in the grand scheme of things is more preferable? Because certainly, in a creative era, knowledge is messy, it can be replicated, it can be constantly branching. But there of course also exists the danger that in this state, technology can be then misused or appropriated by those with negative intentions. Now, in our time, that's bad, but it's not the most problematic thing. In the era of the Imperium, that is no small thing. You could be looking at systems, planets, entire territories annihilated. So it is something that is of concern. By contrast, the civilization which restricts experimentation, forcing technological inheritance in this more brittle structure, does create an environment where the loss of one archive, one forge, one master lineage could delete entire technologies, because no record or example exists to replace them. With the right custodians, that technology should remain stable and secure, at least in theory. To give one more example that I think is both interesting and applies specifically to the problem of the Mechanicus by focusing too narrowly upon function rather than any broader implications of a piece of technology, I'd consider the ancient Greek device known as the Antikythera mechanism. This was discovered in 1901 by divers working off the Greek island of Antikythera. They were recovering material from a shipwreck dating to the 1st century BCE, and they discovered among the sculptures, pottery and cargo what appeared to be little more than a lump of corroded bronze that split into some fragments. Initially, it wasn't believed to be anything of significant value, as they really couldn't see much of what it was. However, inside those fragments, researchers were shocked to identify an arrangement of precision-cut bronze gears, something that was absolutely unprecedented for the ancient world. This item did not belong in this time period. Then, over decades of study, the fragments were examined through microscopy, cross-sectional X-raying known as tomography, and high-resolution imaging. They began to see that what they had here was almost unbelievable. Inscriptions on the plates helped link its function to astronomical cycles known to Greek mathematicians of the era, and reconstructions and simulations of how it most likely functioned demonstrated that the device could track the positions of the sun and moon, predict lunar and solar eclipses, model the phases of the moon, and represent the irregular orbit known as the lunar anomaly through a complex gear train. Some research even suggests it may have indicated planetary positions based on Greek models, though the surviving evidence is partial. But its construction reflects this sophisticated understanding of astronomy and mechanical engineering. This was in effect the earliest known example of an analog astronomical computer. Its discovery reshaped assumptions about ancient technological capability and remains one of the most significant archaeological finds related to the history of science. But what's more interesting to me is the context of the device in terms of how we think about knowledge through history, in terms of its loss, and contextually understanding just what you have. Whilst a truly amazing achievement for that era, it seems likely that those who crafted it saw it more as a tool to achieve a specific end, rather than understanding that what they had created was essentially a computer, albeit at obviously a basic level in the grand scheme of things. We obviously cannot know for sure how they felt and thought about what they had made, but the fact that there are no known other representative examples of such a thing, it seems reasonable enough of an assumption that this singular device was the only one. The broader takeaway here is that they unwittingly stumbled upon humans' first advancement to something we in the digital age can understand as a computer. Yet after this example in ancient Greece, nothing would be seen that is anywhere comparable until the 14th century CE in Europe's monumental clocks and orreries, and that's roughly 1500 years later. So the amazing thing to think about is, what if in that period of ancient Greece they had understood the more lateral, broad concept of what they had created, not just a tool, but something which could be expanded upon for many other uses, that could have enabled them to begin making true technology that would be more akin to an industrial age. Because when something like that device becomes more commonly implemented into society, as would be seen later with industrial progress, then you have advances that introduce precision and expectations of fine tolerance that then begins to power inventions like firearms, manufacture, textile machinery, steam engines, other industrial systems. One initial spark which is understood and looked at and realized the implications in terms of a broader application suddenly can propel things forward very quickly. In the instance of ancient Greece, that doesn't seem to have occurred. And I hope you can kind of see where I'm going towards in terms of the context for this concept in 40k. Now, I think one slight argument is, yes, they had created this thing, but maybe they couldn't understand it because all of that understanding comes from other contextual situations, other technology and advancements in terms of fabrication and other industrial workforces. Maybe if you don't have those things, you can't really understand the application. I think that's probably fair enough. But in terms of the mechanism itself, its biggest advancement could be viewed as the conceptual groundwork for automation. Complex gear trains and automata would eventually illustrate to us that mechanical sequences could be encoded physically, which is a step which leads directly to that industrial machinery, but eventually complex computation. And that means trade expansion, high accuracy scientific measurement. So the basis of what they had is the fundamental foundation for all advanced human technology, which is incredible. Now, all interesting, but what's the point? Well, the point is that much like the Mechanicus in 40k, the Greeks in many ways did not appear to have the ability to understand really what it is they had, beyond its immediate purpose. And as I say, maybe they were contextually constrained, and I think that's fair enough. Essentially, they'd created something so advanced that just within the limitations of their own existing civilization, they just couldn't see beyond. And admittedly, the analogy here isn't perfect because humanity in the Golden Age very much understood what they had, whereas the ancient Greeks appeared not to. But the principle here is more that the Mechanicus have all this advanced tech, but they're unable to identify some of its more powerful elements even when they literally have them right in their hands. And it's because of that contextual situation. So when we think about technology in the Mechanicus, I do think you can make a comparison from the perspective of lost potential. We know that although the Imperium in M41 appears very advanced, in the broader sense, not at all. Humanity's golden age, the dark age of technology, created devices and science so far beyond anything that could be understood in M41 that this would be akin to somebody finding that ancient Greek device many centuries later. They might be able to, if you're a scientific person, perhaps get it to function in some basic sense, but it would be unknown if they really would even be able to understand that true function. It could end up in use, but probably never as optimally as those who designed it, and perhaps even it might be consigned to just a curiosity, something of interest, if they were unable to figure out its actual purpose. Which is exactly what the Mechanicus do also. They have vaults on Mars and the vast data repositories where they upload all their acquired knowledge, but there must be endless vaults of technology deemed too terrifying for them to even want to consider attempting to understand, like the vaults of Moravac. Because very likely, just as with the ancient Greeks, they have in their possession technology they just do not understand. They don't understand the broader implications of how something could be used or developed. So they might find something which is very interesting and they're like, oh look at what this thing does. But they cannot see beyond to what it could actually propel them toward. Which again, it's an interesting concept and it's quite amusing in the context of 40k. It's part of that dark satirical aspect which is very enjoyable, the bleak misery of knowing they probably have all the answers and technology to achieve their goals, but they exist in the darkness of the future and are too scared to even try to unlock it. One of my favourite past talking points from STC and videos containing apocalypse discussion, along with also the emergence of the Imperium out of the Age of Strife, is the apparent inability most people have to grasp just how astonishingly difficult it is for a civilization to make anything, let alone mass-produce complex goods at a global and continental scale. Now, when I say most people, I'm not including many of you watching because, like myself, you probably are equally interested and have considered this also. But I do always get the comments of, why don't they just do such and such? Why don't they figure it out? Why don't they reverse engineer, etc.? And in fairness, most of us never really need to encounter thinking about such things in our daily lives because the vast majority of our population just accept that food turns up at a supermarket, products get made, things can be fixed and infrastructure maintained. The reason why we don't think about that is pretty simple. It's not necessary. Interesting as it might be to an individual, you don't need to understand how that happens because it is just part of being in a complex technology-based society that's very compartmentalized. It's part of the structure and design of that. We fulfill our role and you don't need to think too much beyond that. Mine apparently is helping people sleep and de-stress. And just a small aside, I really do take that as a big compliment when people say something like, I'm just about to do the washing up or cut the lawn to listen to this, because I know how much I crave filling that mental space when I've got things to do, chores to do. And beyond that, one of my core driving forces these days has been the many messages I've received in the past 7 or 8 years from ex-military, people in high-stress positions like surgeons, saying to me, this really helped after a difficult day. Or, as I've spoken about in that video before, when you're at a low mental health point, hyperfixating on something is often what you need to get you through that, and it's very humbling to me that somebody would consider me for that role. Anyway, this just seemed an applicable tangent to be able to fit in something I've often wanted to say there, so there you go. So, being specialised and compartmentalised is nothing new to our own age. In fact, it began as far back as really the early Bronze Age, because then you start seeing specialisations. It's just that it's become ever more refined over time. Eventually, people reach a point where they gradually begin to lose sight of how other aspects of their own society functioned beyond their own field of view. Because once economic and technological systems get larger than any individual can see or comprehend, it all just fades into a general sense of background things happening that you know need to happen, but you can't really concern yourself with. And as I say, that really started as far back as the ancient period in history, where long-distance trade started to be created. The networks soon get quite complex, more so than a single craftsman of that age is going to be able to perceive. And once you reach the mechanization and supply chains of an industrial period, there's an increasing demand for ever more specialized labor, and that's only going to further narrow people's perceptions. So in the modern era of technology, we've reached a high level of compartmentalization, in the sense that most of us now interact with needs, goods, systems that are built through processes so layered and globally distributed that no individual, expert or not, can really understand the whole thing. And honestly, the more you think about how complex our world is now, it really does start to make your head hurt. Like, if you had to start from scratch, where would you begin? And it's another reason as to why people tend not to think about that stuff. But as was true with colonists during the exodus from our solar system, if you lose some people in that complex system, everything can start to fall apart. Which, if you've not watched my Apocalypse video, please do, link below. And I really do want to get back to the next one for that. It's very overdue, as well, so many of my videos, but I will get to it. So for most of us, though, manufacturing looks very mundane from the outside. Of course, in actuality, it represents one of humanity's most improbable accomplishments, that being the ability to coordinate minerals, chemistry, energy, logistics, mathematics, precision engineering, all into this single seamless process. And none of that was possible in the ancient period, when we're highly focused on just stuff like food production and general essentials. You can't do any of the more complicated things until that stuff is stable. And then you start making major cultural leaps in technology. And this is why many futurists and science fiction authors have also often talked about that for any real civilization to exist out in the galaxy, the key to this, really above all else, is stability. Because if you don't have stability, you really can't make that progress that's necessary. Most advanced technology maintains its production with just a thin equilibrium held in place by hundreds if not thousands of other interwoven systems. And should any of these become very disrupted, the consequences would be felt in pretty short order. But of course, any major producer is still going to have contingency buffers in the form of stockpiling and so on, but that's only going to get you so far. So imagine a world centuries, millennia into the future. What might that next cycle of development look like? While resources used to exist at one time just around on the surface of the planet, they steadily become more difficult to acquire. Much of our core resources are, of course, very finite. So what might future industry look like? Are they going to be forced to seek methods to extract from scraps of scraps? You're going to need other things to make that stuff possible, in the form of specialized chemical knowledge to retrieve and process usable metals, chemicals from the detritus to maybe make into plastics and so on, polymers. We're doing that even now. We're trying to find these things. Because without that, it's going to be almost impossible without laboratories, stored knowledge, supply chains, and other things that we just take for granted. So, is that what happened at the dawn of humanity's golden age in the ancient history of the 40K verse? had Earth basically become depleted, and so they were forced to innovate while they still could and push out into the galaxy. Again, it's not just about raw materials, it's also about the complexity and the fragility of what you're actually able to produce. Look at the level of refinement we've already reached. Current cutting-edge transistors have features that are only a few dozen atoms across at their smallest dimension, which I really think you cannot comprehend. That is absolutely crazy for any normal person not involved in that kind of production to consider how you would even begin to go about creating transistors that have like a dozen atoms across them. For example, a recent Apple M1 Ultra chip has 114 billion transistors, which for anybody not in the tech industry, that is almost incomprehensible. It would be right to make the analogy of being indistinguishable from magic. And this is the point I'm trying to get at. We already now are at a point where much of what we make is only possible through the use of other advanced tech. That is obvious. But as we move ever closer towards things like quantum computing and the possibility of things like fusion producing all the energy we might need, it seems probable we will enter into an entirely new exponential rise of technology, another huge leap forward. Except this is only going to occur through a process of machines building machines, working with tolerances that are far outside the capability of just humans. It's where we begin drifting toward the sci-fi, because perhaps at some point we may even approach something closer to a real, by definition, AI, which could then begin to design and operate tools, concepts which propel us even further forward. It's fantastical, but it's not impossible. And this is where I would speculate things ended up in the 40k timeline. And I apologize it took me a little time to get there, but it's just how it is. As for the AI and the Men of Iron, I'll refer back to that tome of Keeper Crippius, that very rare piece of lore, and as I always say, a singular reference is certainly questionable, but in this instance there's not much else to contradict it. Crippius existed in 993 M41. He's a keeper within the library Sanctus upon Terra, and his task is essentially that of something like a historiator or an archiver, delving into the unending rotting library archives on Terra to attempt to build some history of human civilization, and to that end they find references to the dark age of technology. And as I've spoken to this before in the STC video, I'll make a bit of a summary of it with just selected elements rather than the whole thing. Crippius speaks about how the Emperor is joined by the first men of the Golden Race, fine of limb, strong of mind. Yet still the Emperor is content to wait in the shadow, to watch and learn from mankind. The Golden Race spreads across the face of old Earth, multiplying and establishing order and civilization on the anarchy of nature. The Golden Men are believed to be some combination of selective breeding and genetically engineered superhumans. It's a largely discredited concept, but in terms of science fiction you see it in stuff like Dune, Star Trek, this kind of idea that they could genetically manipulate towards a more perfect, supreme human element. And I believe that that is likely the template for where things began to enable the genetic technology that existed post-unification to then create the likes of the Primarchs and the Space Marines. It's certainly why you have these genetic scientists knocking around on Earth in the unification time. Crippius's journal then talks about how the second men of the Stone Race appear, and in their wake come many miracles and marvels of technology that strengthen the Stone Men's power, but are also harnessed by those of the Golden Race. So we know the Stone Men are cyborgs, basically. They're partially organic, but they're also synthetic with advanced and powerful bodies. It's likely they were human, in my opinion, and they are sort of more, again, advanced stages forward in our evolution of some description. They're certainly difficult to discern from being human because it's believed that we see one surviving stone man in a short story Ancient History, which is very worthwhile to check out. Spoilers, he is able to easily fabricate, for example, augmatics that would likely be outside of a Mechanicus' capability in that space of time, and to even just obliterate Chaos Space Marines that even surprises them. So that gives you a sense of just how advanced and powerful they were, that even Chaos Marines seemed just unaware of what they are facing. They didn't even recognize this individual as being anything other than just a sort of human menial, when in actuality he's this terrifying figure. To be clear, none of this is 100% confirmed, but it pretty much fits beyond any other explanation of that character. But also next Crippius speaks about how the Golden Men and the Stone Men work together to reach into the stars, that the Stone Men create machines of great power to reach into the galaxy. But over time, the Golden Men's influence dwindles. They become perhaps too reliant on the creations of the Stone Men, and the Stone Men emerge in a position of power or authority. I think really that's speaking to how those higher thinking golden creations became dulled by the more relevant advancements of the synthetic humans. And there may even be some sort of power struggle there, hence the phrasing of Stone Men prevailing. To prevail, you have to have something to prevail over. So humanity has expanded into the stars, and the Stone Men, with their ability to create powerful, zenith-level technology, stay in control. Of course, ordinary humans exist in this time also. But that is when the Iron Men begin to appear. They are created by the Stone Men to assist in the expansion of human civilization. This is referred to by Crippius as the Dark Age of Technology. And before, he does speak about the Golden Age, so there seems to be some differentiation there in this record. It's also when navigators begin to appear, and in general, more military-based technological expansion. It describes how the Mechanicus emerges at the end of this period, which is of course the Age of Strife, and that would be the cult Mechanicus that emerges. Although Crippius describes it as the Adeptus Mechanicus, that's not the case because that only existed post-heresy. Before that, it was of course the Mechanicum. And this is where the war with the Men of Iron begins. The Stone Men and humanity fight against the machines they have created. It doesn't really speak about AI, but ultimately this leads to the complete destruction of the Iron Men, and seemingly also with it the destruction of AI that would occur in that time. It's not mentioned, but we know that that's sort of what happened. Soon thereafter, despite having survived, the destruction was so great that humanity could barely begin to recover, and then the Age of Strife descended, removing all hope. So humanity had seen this near exponential growth in technology and power, but over time this became led or enabled less by the human elements of those gold and stone men and more strongly by its AI and the machines, the Men of Iron. Because even if the humans remained technically the ones signing off on the decisions, it's clear that the machines create these components that are the most complex things ever built, basically. These ultra-clean, multi-stage instruments, fabrication facilities which depend on very complex supply networks, materials, centuries of accumulated scientific practice. It all gets so complex to the point that no individual could really understand even a substantial part of that process, which in the Golden Age and the Dark Age of technology obviously creates a big problem. Because humanity ends up in a position where nobody could really reproduce the computational world which existed. And scarily, I think that's partially true even now, let alone if we shifted forward to something like the early Dark Age of technology. But it's why in that era for humanity, the collective knowledge which spanned thousands of years became for a time our ultimate power, retaining it, safeguarding it, and making it accessible for all during humanity's stellar expansion was so incredibly vital. But unfortunately, as the drive forward and the creation of advanced AI to make that possible also led into this downward spiral where seemingly control was lost, and likely it's that trope of artificial intelligence making decisions without any authority, and that's where things ended up. Think of it like this: modern computers aren't just machines, they're the condensed expression of civilization itself. Just like the Antikythera mechanism, they represent the compounded knowledge that stretches back through maths, physics, electronics, geology, minerals, machining, chemistry, trade, all of that stuff collected together. So were you at any point in that historical chain to significantly disrupt or outright remove any layer, the whole thing collapses. And then we're back into one of our historically notable dark ages, where everything is put on pause until somebody can pick up the pieces and try and make sense of it, much like the Age of Strife and the Emperor. In fact, that's what the Mechanicus attempt to do in the Imperium and the galaxy of M41. Humanity has fallen so heavily from that golden dark age of technology that despite having the span of 10,000 years, they still struggle to make sense of just what in the Zenith period were likely basic technologies. Yet in the Imperium, they're magic. So while somebody like a 19th century steam engineer could perhaps sketch the basic principles of an engine on the back of a letter, What about somebody trying to do the same with not just the design but the production of a CPU? Remember, the point here is not about could you do it with enough time and space. I'm sure if you understood it, of course you could. It's more the scale of advancement. A clock, a steam engine could be illustrated relatively simply. Modern computer production? It's on an entirely different scale of magnitude. The Mechanicus' inability to innovate isn't simply about their dogma. I mean, it is, but it's also to reinforce this concept of plausible fragility. The idea that humanity could lose the knowledge to recreate its own machines, only to later rediscover tools that cannot be rebuilt without those same machines, let alone the entire scaffold of a highly advanced society. Machine spirits. These are things often described as being semi-autonomous routines, embedded subprograms of vestiges of the earlier artificial intelligences. They're not real true AI, they're sort of just something in between. Now, whether they really are in any sense a full AI or more likely just these sophisticated automated systems, it's not clear. It's not clear whether Mechanicus can make that differentiation. But the point really remains that the technology operating at a level that even an ordinary human or even those in the Mechanicus can't really comprehend. They definitely can't replicate to a significantly base level. And this is why the cult of the Mechanicus treat it all as if it's so spiritual, because to them it is. But also it helps to hide away. It creates a facade around the scale of their ignorance. Most ordinary pleb citizens, and even whatever qualifies as engineers or other related adepts in the Imperium, have in actuality very little to any idea how their machines function. They only know the rituals, the basic maintenance which keeps them running. And that is a very relatable concept. It's why that aspect of the law is so intriguing, because choose whatever you want: phone, car, PC, the power grid that connects us. The majority of us do not understand them at the level required to replicate in any way at all. And for that matter, even most experts don't really understand them fully, like I said. And unlike a medieval plough, a mill, or some loom or something, they're not really objects that can just be readily reconstructed by simple, passed along instructions. They're just way too complicated. Now, I do feel like I've overstated that concept, but it's because it's pretty fundamental. So then, if we're thinking about the Imperium and the Mechanicus, why is it that they are so resistant to developing new technology? Well, as I said earlier, for one, they're just scared to do so. They just do not have the ability, also beyond literal genius tier individuals like the Emperor, Call, and so on. Because to create something genuinely new in the environment of the Imperium, it's just exponentially harder, because in their reality, the vast majority of humans, they don't have the time, the initiative, the knowledge, just the principles required, not even fundamentally the concept of creativity. Moreover, because each new innovation typically requires an even deeper supply of knowledge, infrastructure, and most importantly a cooperative willpower to develop relevant expertise, I mean, a lot of that just doesn't exist in the Imperium. So when even thinking about just clearing a bar to develop such a process, so for the Mechanicus and the Imperium, just even thinking about clearing the bar to developing such processes, that is astronomically high. It's no surprise that really little technological development occurs in M41, because it's just a void between what they have and what they actually know that really is the key. The Mechanicus have just existed in this state where they're both simultaneously terrified to fail and to fall further, but also way too fragmented to make any meaningful, stable progress forward, which of course might be starting to shift now with the stronger, more public involvement and influence of someone like Belisarius Cawl. Because when the Men of Iron rebelled against humanity and the Stone Men, it began the unstoppable spiral to the point at which humanity knew it could no longer trust nor rely upon artificial intelligence. All the AIs appeared to have been as close to, as completely as possible, systematically destroyed. Because of the advanced state of technology in this time, it also lost those entities that truly understood the scale of heights human technology had ascended to. Human civilization in this period appeared to have become more of a beneficiary rather than an architect of its own technology, which makes a lot of sense in the context of the whole story there. And so once the AIs vanished, so did its capacity to recreate the systems they maintained, and seemingly, even though likely stone men existed, The Age of Strife that isolated the entire human empire of that time sealed its fate. Nothing could be recovered, and for whatever reason thereafter, the Stone Men just seemed to disappear. But it makes a lot of sense again in the story of what we know. The crusade of the Emperor, those societies that were very advanced and appeared to have some sort of functioning STC, which we presume has an AI component to it, they were only rediscovered quite late into the crusade. And again, that makes sense because it's far, far, far away from what I would guess would be the epicenter of Earth and Terra itself. So some planets did survive with STC, but they were far, far away, perhaps isolated from the worst of things, and perhaps that's why their societies decided, you know what, we're not going to destroy our STC AI. One thing is for sure though, the machines of that time are just far too advanced for the bulk of the Imperium to reverse engineer. And I appreciate always those of you who work in technology and engineering who have contributed many times to restating this fact over the years, that to really reverse engineer something, you have to firstly know what it was in the first place, and secondly, know much about the processes and the principles that existed within that piece of technology. You can't just kind of look at it and guess, or if you do, I guess it's going to be extremely complicated. It's certainly going to be easier to do with a piece of ancient Greek clockwork that predicts solar system cycles than it is with a hyper-advanced, massive Arch Mechanicus ship. And that's before you even consider also knowing the tools required to make such things, which also do not exist in any form. And all of that leads us to the grim truth of the centre of 40K's technological stagnation and why the Mechanicus cling so stubbornly to ritual. As I thought to reference it as the STC lie, because it is of course the fact that the Imperium is not failing to invent singularly because of its ignorance, its superstition, or just its needless cruelty. It's because the foundational knowledge and the technical capability required to move forward is missing at a very structural level, which has been readily highlighted by somebody like Belisarius Cawl, that just there is no longer this base level of intrigue, even among the Mechanicus. It's why Cawl is so intriguing as a character. Yes, he's arrogant and over the top, but it's because he sees himself as being so far above the ordinary human and Mechanicus members. He's genuinely interested. He's got this passion which just doesn't exist anymore. And it's not just about his intellect. It's not about that. It's about how he sees and thinks about things differently, essentially as humanity once did so long ago in its ancient time. Because with AI essentially outlawed, even were they to find a horde of golden age technology, they may just be entirely incapable of reproducing it. There may be components that only an AI could replicate or understand the principles of, and it's this that was lost in the aftermath of the Dark Age of technology. It's not about the technology itself, it's about the means by which you can understand and produce that. And once you can understand that, you begin to realize that what was lost out of the Dark Age of technology, it wasn't just about AI, it wasn't just about STC, it was about losing an entire scale and level of technology that's been cut off from human capability, perhaps forever. The conclusion out of this is to consider what was lost and then how did it influence what followed. My still speculative conclusion to all this is that when the Emperor emerged during the Age of Strife, he inherited a civilization that desperately clung to the shattered remnants of the Dark Age of technology. The golden achievements of that era had depended on systems which either no longer existed or that humanity no longer controlled. We had collapsed into a state of isolated fragmentation, war and technological amnesia. The Emperor, unlike most, had witnessed the events before and the aftermath firsthand. He was able to see and understand how a species which had once stood at the edge of transcendence was now reduced to pockets of survival, unable to rebuild tools and systems it had once relied heavily upon, and that without something to intercede would be destroyed next time to the point of complete extinction. I would suggest that it's possible the Emperor looked at this and saw how humanity had been inseparable from the capabilities of the AI it had created. The results had proven catastrophic. The Men of Iron had become a definitive warning, And I would consider that the Emperor and perhaps Malcador, if they were known to one another in this time, which is, we believe, possible, they assessed that the return of autonomous machine minds was no longer a viable path, but that also without them, the advanced technology that was the focused base for the Golden Age could never again be recreated. Not because humans lacked imagination or the ability to climb that ladder once more, but because the comprehension and the organizational scale needed to rebuild it had been lost in terms of the machines themselves. And in this speculative view, the Emperor recognized that without AI, there now likely existed a hard ceiling on what a purely human, non-AI civilization could achieve. Thinking about that, this then helps to frame the choices made during the Unification Wars and the Great Crusade. The Emperor and Malcador instead opt to steer humanity toward a model of what is capable, to maintain secularism, to avoid the pitfalls of worship, to restore rational scientific practice where possible, and use the Mechanicum's industrial might to rebuild a functioning interstellar state. The Mechanicum, bound by their dogma and ritual, could preserve, replicate and repair, but not really innovate. And I'd imagine that again, the Emperor likely understood that this stagnation was just a built-in truth of the post-AI reality. If we think about this understanding, then the broader strategy begins to make more sense, from the perspective that if humanity could no longer reach its previous technological heights, then its future could not depend on such tools alone. Instead, the Emperor began to develop the one domain where human potential did exceed its past: psychic evolution. This path, while more dangerous and volatile, was something artificial intelligences could not replicate. Psychic ability offered a different kind of power, one rooted in the human soul rather than engineered systems, that if properly guided, it could become a new form of civilization. The Emperor's long-term project in this interpretation was this aim to push humanity towards a controlled psychic awakening, one that could eventually break or bypass the vulnerabilities that bound mortals to the warp. If chaos could not be truly destroyed, perhaps it could be rendered irrelevant by reshaping humanity into something capable of navigating or transcending the dangers that had always limited it. If it could achieve this, then it could embark upon a new future where humanity no longer saw itself needing to depend on machines and infrastructure of impossible complexity, a civilization freed from the fragility that had once destroyed it. And perhaps this was just coincidence. Perhaps the Emperor saw that the way to technology was lost, but that the warp was always going to be the final challenge to overcome, and so it really was irrelevant that the age of advanced technology was left in the forgotten past. Perhaps it was just something he thought that it was necessary to get out of human civilization's system. I think it's very clear that the Emperor fully understood the dangers posed by runaway artificial intelligence and the consequences of relying on systems that humans could no longer control. Hence, he didn't appear to make any significant effort to revive such things. Instead, he relied upon biological warriors to fight and define his era, the Astartes. He needed a civilization that was strong and resilient, but that also could avoid rebuilding those same conditions that led to the Men of Iron and the collapse that followed. Hence, a renewed Golden Age was never his goal, for such an idea had become too dangerous and complex to rebuild. The Imperium's technological stagnation has always existed in the oppressive shadow of the Dark Age of technology, but knowing and understanding how and why STC were created, and that likely they will never be the solution to all problems, leaves the shortcomings of humanity feeling less like a failure of imagination and more like the inescapable aftermath of a civilization that had tethered itself far too tightly to systems that, when they failed, dragged everything down with them. Now they are no longer present, and without those systems, returning to that level of achievement becomes increasingly unlikely. Instead, the Golden Age remains a slowly dissolving memory on the horizon, a dying light that humanity can still see but no longer approach. Not through a lack of willpower, but because the means by which they once may have done so has now completely disappeared. The Imperium exists within a space of limitation, And although they are far from having reached the technological ceiling that will ultimately restrict progress, the solutions to the most fateful issues seem to lie elsewhere than in technology. And with the Great Rift dividing the galaxy, it seems that humanity's psychic awakening may be closer than ever before, and with it, perhaps a new age for humanity and the Imperium.